Now, once nation states could, if they chose to, remain reasonably isolated once upon a time. Now, today, those links are as real as they are immediate. Australia and its engagement process with the world forms the basis of our strategic positioning as a nation state relative to other nations. Key amongst the strategic issues that are facing Australia currently are some of these issues. For example, Australia's trade relations with Asia. That's a pretty big issue. The ratification and launch of multilateral and a whole range of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, such as the ANZFTA, or the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, or the MEFTA, the Malaysia-Australia Free Trade Agreement. The emergence of China is a huge issue. Regional trading blocs. Well, I suppose I already mentioned some of the bilateral links. Political stability and the political economy of countries in the region, as it affects the region, but also as it affects us.
Obviously, the key things to note is the importance of the relationship between Australia and Malaysia and a whole heap of our neighbours. And I want to call them neighbours because I think they're neighbours and friends, and I think it's really important that we continue to develop and grow the relationships that we have in our region, in our backyard, and I certainly see Malaysia as being part of that. So I think it's important that we develop that relationship here and internationally. Last week I had the great privilege of representing Australia at the Asian Development Bank annual meeting, which this year was held in India. And that's really the comments I want to refer to today, because I think that's very important to get some sort of an idea of what's happening on that level. Asian Development Bank is chartered with a whole range of donor countries and member countries to actually raise funds and invest those funds and then spend those funds in recipient countries right across the Asia Pacific. And Australia leads a constituency. In the constituency that I lead, I have this vast array of, I can't quite explain how we ever got to the countries, but spanning from Azerbaijan in the east, which people might find a little bit odd, right through to Samoa, Kiribati, Tonga, and a whole range of our island Pacific neighbours. We had a range of discussions around some of the difficulties that the bank is facing. And if you thought of the Asian Development Bank almost as a nation state, it would give you some sense of what's happening around the world. Asian Development Bank, like many countries, is facing difficult times. Difficult times in terms of trying to get a return on their funds so that we can best not only invest those funds and safeguard those funds for our donor countries, of which, by the way, Australia is the second largest donor behind Japan, with the United States in fourth place. So Australia puts a lot of importance on the work that we do in our region. The opportunity of this annual meeting was really to talk about what's happening globally, all of those pressures that we all talk about almost every day now. There's one thing that struck me though, which I thought was really interesting, was that every other country in the world would literally hack off their right arm to have an economy as good as Australia's. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, it was great to be there, great to feel that warmth from others saying, how do you guys do it? How have you managed through, in the last 5 years, the most challenging and difficult economic times for at least 75 years, if not longer. And sometimes hard to give all of the answers as to all of the parts, but I like to hear what other countries think we're doing right. And I'll tell you what, there's a whole range of things. Certainly the strength of our twin peaks of regulation through ASIC and APRA, and the good work that we've continued to do there, and lots of reforms, and I've been a part of some of those reforms for many years. The way that we managed our national savings, superannuation played an enormous part in where we are today in Australia. Annual savings, now superannuation, Australia's fourth largest funds under management in the world, $1.55 trillion in superannuation. That's an enormous number. When you compare that to any other developed country, it is phenomenal, the size of it. But also if you compare it to what happens in the United States, it's massive. We actually can compete with the United States in terms of super funds, or pension funds as they call them over there. So there's a great story here. Interest rates, obviously, we still have them, which is an interesting and really good thing. It's not the first thing you think of with interest rates. People want them as low as they can possibly go. Well, let me tell you, in some countries, including the United States, they're zero. And they actually would trade zero for the official cash rate of 3% here, because they actually need an interest rate. Not only does it provide you flexibility and options, but it means that if you're somebody who's investing and you're actually in a pension scheme, you actually get some return on your money. So there's all these, but particularly for me, it was two things that in all the discussions we had with finance ministers, economic ministers and leaders of a whole range of countries, was the fact that we've had a focus on jobs and a focus on infrastructure. And these were the two key things that came out of a week's worth of meetings at ADB. Our unrelenting focus on job creation, keeping unemployment low, and making sure that we spend on skills and skill development, and that we have an immigration program in this country that facilitates that. So particularly through our good quality 457 visa scheme, which we're still managing, and you have to manage these things through all the time. The other was our spending programs on infrastructure, which is also about job creation, but also means that we have all of the elements that are needed for business to do their job. And it's something that we don't really understand when you're here in Australia.
Not only are we doing better than other countries, not only are other countries prepared to give, as he put it, an arm to be as well off as Australia, but it's not by accident. It's not that a mining boom came along driven by the demand out of China. It's that we, over a couple of decades, have got things right about our economy. We've got things right. For example, superannuation, as he mentioned. This great pool of savings, this country that once was short of capital, desperately short of capital, is now exporting capital to the world. We're a big investor in the United States of America, huge investor in the US. And that's a transformation of Australia. It didn't happen by accident, but it happened because people back in the 80s conceived the idea of driving universal occupational superannuation, a huge reform. And we took hard decisions to get the independence of the Reserve Bank, the management, the finance sector straightened out, the banking sector. So our banking sector flourished when the banks in the United States tottered. I once gave a speech back when I was Premier of New South Wales on the great decisions Australia has got right. We're actually a smart people. We've got things right. And as a result, we're doing well today. And I'm not being partisan in this. I give credit to the other side of politics. As a people, we've got things right. And as a result, we're enjoying this strong position in the world economy today. Craig Emerson drove that very, very hard. And when it got to a sticking point, he looked across the table at his Malaysian counterpart and said, "We'll forgo that. We'll forgo that." And he tells me that the Malaysians were struck by the fact that an Australian Minister for Trade who's prepared to give up something big, something that Australia was fighting on, to get this into place. And when we talk about Australia in the 18th century, we're talking about the sum total of those sorts of responses. It's Craig Emerson doing that. It's me forgoing the opportunity to lash out at Malaysia because of what we're being told about the conduct of the election, showing appropriate restraint, emphasising diplomacy. It is the work of the Australian business sector. It's the hospitality that Malaysian students enjoy in Australia. And it is us linking ourselves to the growth, the trajectory of growth in that Malaysian economy. But think of the Malaysian investment on Australia. 14 billion by 2011, that had been an increase of 8.4 billion the previous year. Now, that's a huge leap. That's an increase of 66% in 1 year. And again, that reflects the fact that Australia in economic management is getting things right. The bottom line, all this is going to be determined by the intelligence of the Australian people. We've got to be careful about those who talk about Australia seeing itself as part of the Anglosphere. Of course, we've got good relations with America, with the UK, with Canada, New Zealand, old friends, sharing a more or less common background. But it's our engagement with Asia that's crucial today, and also our engagement with Africa, where we've got $50 billion in Australian mining investment. We made great friends with the Caribbean. Every one of the 14 Caribbean nations voted for us when we stood for the Security Council. They saw us as a champion, as a nation that talks about climate change, about the quality of the oceans, about a small arms treaty, and about helping them with a little memorial to the transatlantic slave trade. The ambassador of one of the Caribbean nations stood up at a meeting I addressed and said, "We welcome what Australia's done to commemorate the slave trade, which is so important to us. We expected no less of a country that made the apology." Because Decima Williams, the ambassador of Grenada, she knew about the apology to Aboriginal Australians and regarded Australia highly as a result. And I'll conclude with another observation on that win we had in October last year at the Security Council. We campaigned hard for that. The votes were cast by the ambassadors in New York. The ambassadors to 193 nations to the UN in New York. We had to impress those ambassadors. We brought them down to Australia in groups of 10, brought them down to Australia. The most striking impression they had of this country was its multiculturalism. They couldn't believe it. As the editor of the Jakarta Post said to me a few weeks ago, they said the same thing. You walk from a hotel in Brisbane down to the riverfront and you're struck by the number of Asian faces.
So how are we going to manage this relationship with the US such that it is not misconstrued as any kind of going back to the colonial days or any kind of threat to the autonomy of nation states within the region?
China tends to be opposed to what they see as Cold War alliances. They don't like the notion of alliance structures. Australia, small population, large continent, really wants a treaty relationship with a dominant world power. So we've got different perspectives. The point is, it's a challenge for our diplomacy to manage both, to manage the relationship with China, which really wants to query why Australia would have a security relationship with the US, and to manage our relationship with the United States. I've got to say that dealing with the Obama administration is a pretty comfortable thing. They present less concerns for a Labor government especially than did some of the adventurous foreign policy stances of the Bush administration. The influence of neoconservatism and ultranationalism as strands among other strands in their foreign policy. We're going to continue to work at that treaty relationship. Our relations with John Kerry, the new Secretary of State, are very good. The China-US relationship is the most important relationship in the world today, and there's going to need to be statesmanship on both sides. Managing the rise of China or the re-emergence of China is going to require a lot of statecraft, and the US is going to have to manage a relative decline. Now, how they come to an accommodation in the Asia Pacific is going to be extremely interesting. It's not something where Australia can be an arbitrator or provide a bridge. And the Chinese see us as being an ally of the United States. And as I said earlier, Americans have got their own deep understanding of China. They've worked at it for a long time, and they invest an awful lot in that relationship. And right into the White House, there's a focus on building that China relationship. But our worst nightmare as a country would be a breakdown in that US-China relationship. That's our nightmare. Not only our nightmare, but a nightmare for Indonesia, for Malaysia, for Singapore. We've got a big stake in the existing superpower and the rising superpower, settling their differences, coming to accommodations, building the areas of cooperation. in their bilateral relationship. A breakdown in that relationship would be a nightmare.
I might just add something, not that, Bob, you haven't completely answered the question, because you have, but just a thought that came in my mind just in terms of things that I was doing last week. And when you ask the question, what can we do to ensure the relationship, but also make sure that it doesn't portray the wrong image to others? And I think Bob dealt with that in a range of different ways. I think we're already doing those things in the way we act at the G20, for example. While we're not part of ASEAN, we do at the side, at the edges of ASEAN, actually organise, so Australia organises an informal meeting of finance and economic ministers. We're also a major player in the Asia-Pacific region, and in fact when the US does pivot, they're looking back towards us and our region. We're a key player in that. We can be a more significant player, I think, on global platforms in terms of how we manage the relationship with the United States, but also how it's portrayed by others. And I think that is part of that mix, and that's the things that we currently are doing through foreign affairs and also through our trade portfolios and departments. So from my perspective, I think we're actually working through what is a really complex mix, but working through that balance of still doing the right things that we need to do with the United States and still managing to be part of our region fully.
Well, I'd like to invite everybody to give the gentleman a round of applause. Thank you very much.